here at Samsung. I actually just discovered the other day that my neighbor had seen my face on one of your floors, my neighbor Daniel. And so shout out to Daniel if you're watching on Zoom. Let me start, thank you for the kind introduction. Who am I and what are we doing at Stanford? Well, as Stefano mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford, and my job there effectively is to lead a portfolio of research in the future of transportation as we see it. So our work is supported by a large number of affiliates, and we take that money and we invest that money in projects that we think are particularly critical to the future of transportation. This is my office. I always dreamed of working in a garage, and that's something that I get to do today. Our garage has about half a dozen vehicles in it. It has a vehicle simulator. It has a machine shop with machine tools that students can use to prototype physical parts. And these vehicles form the basis, basically platforms that the students can use to conduct a large variety of different research projects at Stanford. Now, this is something that I wanted to do to provide a little bit of context. Stanford is considered one of the central elements of Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley has sometimes been called the new Detroit. And I wanted to share a little bit with you why that's actually been the case. Now, this is a map of Silicon Valley, and if you see there, roughly in the center is where Stanford is. This is a map that was put together by a friend of mine at CBRE, a real estate company. And the man that put this together just started almost as a hobby, tracking the companies that were in the automotive or transportation space in Silicon Valley about 4.5 years ago. You can see this first map was dated February 2014. And he just kept with the hobby. Every time he would hear about a new company that was moving to the area, he would track it. And I wanted to show you what those efforts turned into. So the next map that he produced was in April 2016. You can see quite a few more companies, not just automotive companies, but also now suppliers, more broad mobility companies, and a few startups. So just keep stepping forward in time. March 2017, April 2017, May 2017. Let's click forward a little bit faster here. July, August, September, October, November, December, January 2018, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, and January. This is the last slide that I have. What can you see that's happened here? Well, there are a couple of pretty obvious things, right? Which is that the sheer number of companies has grown enormously. There are now several hundred companies here in the Bay Area that are doing things either in the transportation space or adjacent to the transportation space. The second thing that you notice is the diversity of the companies. This is not just automotive manufacturers, technology companies, or suppliers. There are a lot of startups. There are a lot of companies that are doing very, very different things in this space. Now, the last thing that I think you should probably pay attention to is that on some of these slides, there are actually numbers underneath them. And that's actually the number of square feet that company is occupying at that particular location. And if you look carefully at those numbers, what you realize is not only is the sheer quantity of companies increasing, but the footprint at each of these companies is also increasing. So, 5 or 10 years ago in Silicon Valley, there were companies here, but there were only a few thousand square feet. And most of what they were doing was technology scouting, maybe a little bit of venture activities. But today, what you're seeing is major companies doing engineering and development in Silicon Valley in the automotive space. Now, at Stanford, at CARS, we work with many of these companies. We have about 40 sponsors for our work. Samsung has been a sponsor for many years. Thank you for your support. These 40 companies are all contributors of equal. And one of the things that gives us is the freedom to conduct research in areas that we think are particularly important. So we're not really beholden to any one of these stakeholders. Now, we wouldn't be much of a transportation institution, an academic institution, if we didn't actually teach. And so one of the things that I wanted to call attention to is really a prelude to the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is a class that I teach called Ethics and Equity in Transportation Systems. Now, this is a class that didn't exist 3 years ago. And Chris Gerdes and I what we realized at Stanford was that the popularity of transportation was growing enormously. So when I graduated from an undergraduate degree program almost 20 years ago, I went to work for Ford Motor Company. And the reaction that I got from my colleagues and friends at MIT was, really? You're going to go work for a car company? It was one of those things that people didn't really understand. They thought that automotive or transportation, it was a safe but not a very exciting place to go to work as a young professional. Well, fast forward to today, and exactly the opposite is true, which is that transportation is considered an exciting but not very safe place to work, right? And what that means is that there's an influx of new engineers and scientists and data scientists that are coming from places like Stanford, and they want to work in the transportation space. And what we discovered was that many of these students have the technical knowledge, the technical capabilities that they need to contribute in this space, but they don't necessarily have the sense of responsibility that they need. As many of you probably know, transportation is one of those industries that profoundly affects people's lives. It affects your access to employment, your ability to take care of your family, your access to social engagements. And so we kicked this class off a few years ago, really with the goal that we were going to help imbue this sense of responsibility in these students. Okay, so what are we seeing today? Well, we're seeing a combination of new vehicle types, like you see here on the left. In some cases, they're relatively conventional vehicles with a little bit of automated driving capability, like you see on the top left. In other cases, you're seeing vehicles like these, the top right and the bottom left here, smaller vehicles that are designed to carry just one or two people around at relatively low speeds in an urban environment. And you're also seeing vehicles like this one on the bottom right, vehicles that are kind of a hybrid between public and private transportation. They're smaller than a bus, but bigger than a car, and again designed to carry a small number of people around in an urban environment. Now we're also seeing new services by which we're accessing transportation. So these could be car sharing services like Zipcar or Car2Go, or they could be ride-hailing services like Uber or Didi. And so one of the questions that you might want to understand is, well, how are people adapting and how are businesses and cities changing as a result of these new products and these new services in the transportation space? Now, one of the charts that I like to show is this one on the left, which is that the takeaway here is that ride-hailing grew faster than McDonald's, right? So anybody know by the show of hands how long it took McDonald's to sell 1 billion hamburgers? It's about 10 years, right? 10 years to sell 1 billion hamburgers. But if you see the cumulative number of rides on the right, on the y-axis here, and then you see time on the x-axis, it took Uber about half that time to sell 1 billion rides. Now, that was in 2015, and by June the following year, Uber had sold its 2 billionth cumulative ride. And the former CEO used to like to brag that this was actually a 174-way tie. Well, why is that? It's a 174-way tie because 174 people had booked a ride at exactly the same second, right? So that should give you a sense of scale here. Now, if you're to sort of loosely group Uber and Didi and Ola and Grab and Lyft and all the other services that are in this space, my estimate is that the run rate is about 50 million rides per day. That's roughly the magnitude of the system that we're talking about today. And I think it's worth noting that micromobility, e-scooters, e-bikes in a shared context, the cumulative rate of rides delivered in those services is actually growing faster. At least as of right now, it's growing faster than the ride-hailing space did just a few years ago. So it's something to keep a close eye on. Now, one of the questions that you might want to ask is, well, how is this affecting cities? This rapid growth of a new transportation mode really is affecting cities, certainly somehow. How is it affecting cities? And this is actually really a kind of a difficult question to ask because really what you would like to do as a scientist, you'd like to basically create an alternate universe where these services were never invented, and then compare that universe to the universe that we actually live in today. And academics would call this the counterfactual, right? Now, unfortunately, we can't actually do that, but there's some other creative things that academics can do. And a friend of mine, Regina Clulo, did this work a couple of years ago with a friend of hers and asked people that were using a ride-hailing service, what would you have done if this service didn't exist? And then across the bottom here, you see the different answers that people gave. The number one thing that people said was that they would not have taken the trip, right? This is trips that they would not have taken, and now they are taking as a result of the existence of this ride-hailing service. Now, the number two thing that people said was they would have driven a private car, drive, and Now these are miles that would have been driven in a private car, and now they're being driven in a shared car. So probably not a ton of net change in terms of distance traveled in a vehicle. A little bit probably as a result of efficiency of these services, but let's call it a net zero there. Now in the middle here, we see walking, biking, public transit, and carpooling. These are all people that would have taken potentially a more physically active mode, right? Or a mode that has a denser grouping of passengers. And so these are the people that cities are really worried about, right? These are potentially causing additional congestion, potentially having health impacts to these passengers. And so as a result, you're seeing kind of this tense relationship between cities and mobility providers, and we're seeing that play out in a number of interesting ways. I just wanted to share a couple of examples with you from the past few years. The first example, I think, is a great example of how cities and mobility providers can work together. This is a headline from 2017. DC gives Uber and Lyft a better spot in the nightlife. So DC, like many cities, has struggled over the years with people that are driving under the influence. And so what DC decided to do was to eliminate parking from Thursday night to Sunday morning in a part of the city that was specifically known to be a place where a lot of people would go to clubs and bars. Now the idea here is to make it easier for people to take a shared ride. All these parking spots now became pick-up and drop-off zones for taxis or for ride-hailing vehicles. The idea is to make it easier for people to get into a shared vehicle that they're not driving and make it harder for them to get into a vehicle where they would be potentially driving under the influence. And so I think this is a great example of it's a technical solution to a social problem, right? And it's my understanding that DC is currently evaluating the results from this experiment. So great example of collaboration between cities and transportation companies. So let's take an example that I think is less positive. So in 2015, Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York wanted to implement a cap on the number of ride-hailing vehicles that were operating in Manhattan. This was congestion concerns, so I don't know if you know, but travel speeds in Manhattan are now down to about 4.5 miles per hour during rush hour. At that point, you might as well walk, right? And so one of the things that New York City had proposed over the years was a cap on the number of vehicles in the ride-hailing services. Now, what was Uber's response? Well, the response, in fact, was to put a new mode in the app, and they called this mode the de Blasio mode, after the mayor of New York. And you can see what happened. So what disappeared? What appeared on the map here? All the cars went away, right? And the wait time, as you can see there, went to 25 minutes. Right? So if you've used Uber or Lyft in New York, you know that the typical wait times are more like 2 or 3 minutes. So this is a catastrophic scenario for you as a ride-hailing customer if you're a passenger in New York. And so what do you see here? Well, if you click that button, you see that this message pops up and it says, de Blasio's Uber, take action. This is what Uber will look like in New York City if Mayor de Blasio's Uber cap bill passes. Email the mayor and the city council, say no to de Blasio's Uber, email now. And if you click the email now button, it would generate an automatic message that would go to the city council and presumably the Taxi and Limousine Commission and the mayor's office. And about 500,000 people saw this message, was the estimate that I read. Now, we have no idea how many of those people actually clicked that button, but if you talk to people in the New York City government, what you hear is there was an avalanche of emails from angry customers that were concerned that their future was actually going to look like this. And at the time, the cap bill actually failed. So this was say a powerful enough voice in the city to actually get that cap bill to be voted down. So fast forward to last year, and the cap was finally approved. So it took really more than 3 years for this cap to actually come back into effect. So I wanted to pause for a minute and ask a question that I almost always ask of my students, which is this question: what is sustainable transportation? So this is something that we throw about. We throw these words around a lot, and we don't really always have a good definition of what this actually means. And so I usually engage in a little bit of back and forth with my students, but I think what I'd like to do is just share this definition that I give them with you. Now, this is a definition that comes from one of the late great transportation engineers at MIT, Joe Sussman. And his assessment was that truly sustainable transportation meant 3 things. And the first one is environment. And that's something that we really directly associate with sustainability. In some cases, that's the only thing that people associated with it. That we really can't do ongoing damage to our environment and expect to have a sustainable transportation system. But that's not the only dimension. The second dimension here would be economy, right? The second E, economy, that you can't lose money forever is maybe a simple way of thinking about that. It also has to do with the economic development and vitality of a region. You want people to have access to jobs. You want people to have access to employment. Now, the third E is equity or social sustainability. And I think the best way to think about this is that in order to have a truly sustainable transportation system, you can't just provide transportation to 5% or 10% of your population. You really need to be providing transportation for 100% of your population. So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done and some opinions about these different dimensions of sustainability. So let's start with equity. Social sustainability. Now, there's some competing narratives here. Now, on one hand, there's evidence that ride-hailing reduces discrimination over traditional taxi services. And there's also evidence that minority users are more likely to try these new micromobility services like scooters and e-bikes. But on the other hand, the service quality still isn't at parity, and some new modes are inherently unavailable to older residents. And there's still not always good solutions for people that don't have access to bank accounts or credit cards, for example. Now, what is the work that I've done in this space? So a few years ago, a friend of mine and I, Don McKenzie, were talking about the rise of ride-hailing. And one of the things that we thought about early on was the issue of discrimination. And as you can see here, discrimination is something that's been part of our social fabric for hundreds of years. And it's become so commonplace to expect that this is actually happening that it makes its way into things like song lyrics, Lenny Kravitz song lyrics in this particular case. And one of the questions that we wanted to understand was, when you think about ride-hailing, the decision that the driver is making to accept your ride and take you on that trip, or to reject your ride and not take you on that trip, that's a decision that's made behind the safety of a mobile phone screen, right? But when we think about the traditional taxi market, that's actually a decision that's made in the public right-of-way. It's a decision of the driver chooses to stop for you or chooses not to stop for you based on what you look like. And one of the concerns that we had was ride-hailing actually eliminating this discrimination, or was it just hiding this discrimination? And so we engaged in a large-scale audit study in Boston and Seattle, and one of the things that we looked for was the rate at which drivers were canceling trips. Because what you actually observe when you accept a trip and you cancel it, in the case of one of the ride-hailing providers, you observe the first name. And in some cases, the first name is enough to convey some information about the race or about the gender of the person that you might be picking up. And what we observed, in fact, was a cancellation rate in Boston that was 2 to 3 times higher for the passengers that used a stereotypically black-sounding name as opposed to a stereotypically white-sounding name. So clearly, there's still some work left to do here in this space, and I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. One of the other questions that I've become increasingly interested in over the years is the question about how we use public space. So this is actually, I don't know if you can read this rolling signboard here. This was actually out by Livermore, taken by a friend of mine. It says, "Expect delays, don't trust your apps," right? So one of the things that we're observing basically is that the way that we're using public space is changing fundamentally. So we're going from a world where all of us each make individual decisions about what route we choose to take, which streets we choose to use more heavily than others. And that decision making is now being concentrated into a few entities that basically make those routing decisions for us. Now, as individual drivers, okay, maybe we're not always using a navigation aid because we know our neighborhood quite well. But if you're a commercial driver, let's say you're driving for a ride-hailing company, you are much more dependent on navigation aids. Although obviously the driver still has some element of decision-making power. In the future, as we move more and more towards levels of automation, the human is going to be taken out of this decision altogether, in the vehicle at least, and that decision is going to be made by the people who design these algorithms. Now, one of the things that I think it's important to pay attention to is that mobility is inherently something that has very local and regional dimensions to it. And I actually just collected a few examples of them here. In Michigan, how many of you have spent some time in Michigan? Okay, a few there. It's a company with an automotive business. Michigan left-hand turns, right? This is a special maneuver where you turn right to go left, right? I don't know of any place in the world other than maybe New Jersey's jug handle turns where you actually have to do this. In San Francisco, we have a unique transportation mode. There's no other place in the world with cable cars that potentially an automated vehicle might have to perceive in the world around it. In Massachusetts, Construction details, every construction site has a uniformed police officer there that's flagging traffic back and forth. Whereas in California, that might be some high school kid on a summer job. In Mexico City, the roundabouts sometimes go clockwise and they sometimes go counterclockwise. It's insane to watch. That's actually a screen grab from a time-lapse photo that I took of the cars going back and forth and pedestrians running back and forth between them, right? The point I'm trying to get across is that our cities are very, very different when it comes to transportation, and that the way that we deal with those cities should be also different. So let's think about this a little bit as a stack. We talk a lot of times as the automated vehicle stack, right? Many of you use that term frequently. But there's actually a mobility stack as well. And our policy assumptions really have been built on this outdated model of this stack. So we have the city and we have policies, say pricing for parking, congestion charging, how we assign lanes, where you're allowed to use certain vehicles, how fast you're allowed to drive. And previously, we essentially had small numbers of mobility devices, bicycles, cars, a few other vehicles like motorcycles maybe, and then we had the passengers and potentially the drivers and owners. But effectively what we've done is we've inserted two new levels into this stack. The first thing is the operators. So this could be a Turo, right? Could be a Didi or a Lime that are actually providing these mobility services. And then on top of that, we basically have a combination of aggregators. These are services that let you access different types of transportation systems, like maybe an e-scooter for part of your trip and a ride-hailing vehicle for another part, and a public transportation system for another part. So companies like Transit and Google Maps are doing this sort of service today. On the operations side, we also have companies like Maestro that are trying to help the drivers go back and forth between apps so that they can earn as much revenue in as short a time as physically possible. So let's talk a little bit about economics in this space. And again, I think what we really are seeing is different competing narratives. On one hand, when we think about ride-hailing, this is a highly flexible form of work. Fits around other employment, be your own boss, the type of expressions that you hear about ride-hailing driving. Easy in entry and exit, start or quit on the same day in a lot of places. That sounds like it's all presumably true, right? But on the other hand, drivers may not fully realize the costs that they incur, and the underestimation of these costs leads to an overestimation of the profit. And you actually see this play out, these two narratives play out in the real world. You see advertisements like this: learn how you can drive for $24 an hour today. On the other hand, you hear stories like this from major news agencies. Drivers are facing financial hardship. 44% of drivers report difficulty paying for work expenses such as gas, insurance, and car maintenance. 96% of drivers quit in less than 12 months. And this is one that I think is actually particularly concerning. 7 million Americans are behind on their car payments. This is actually a 2-decade high for the number of Americans that are either delinquent or in default on their car payments. This is really concerning to me. And for those of you that know me, you've probably seen that I got into a very public dispute about this particular issue with the CEO of Uber last year, where I was called incompetent on Twitter. I suppose not a day goes by where somebody isn't called incompetent on Twitter, but this was my first time. And really, it just spoke to me about how personal this particular issue is, and it's something that I'm continuing to study. You're welcome to look for my statement on the matter on Twitter as well. So let's talk a little bit about the third E today, environment, the third E of sustainable transportation. Now, I mentioned that I teach a class on ethics and equity in transportation systems, and it just so happened that the worst air quality week of the history that I know of, at least recent history in the Bay Area, was the week where we started the module on environments regulation in the class. And this is a picture from Delhi, but for those of you that were here last fall, this is basically what the air quality looked like around here. And I actually gave a talk up in San Francisco during that week, and I actually had to walk about 3/4 of a mile from the venue back to the Caltrain station, and I had to put a handkerchief over my mouth. And even with that handkerchief over my mouth, my lungs and my throat were burning. So this is a really important issue that we're going to be facing as we move forward. Now we see as transportation system evolves, again, we see competing narratives. On one hand, there's evidence that new mobility reduces car ownership, right? People might be shedding a second car or maybe even giving up car ownership altogether. It's easier than ever before to share a ride. And micromobility options permit us to really downsize. When we've just got a short trip, maybe with just one passenger, we don't need a car anymore. We can use an e-scooter or an e-bike. But on the other hand, there's evidence of increased traffic and miles traveled. Congestion in major cities is getting worse, and there are increasing number of studies that actually point to ride-hailing as one of the causes of this, not one of the solutions. The reported declines in public transit usage, that basically concerns us for two reasons. One is the economics of those systems, and two is the potential environmental impact that we're seeing. And one of the other things that we observe is that there are lots of hybrids in new mobility services, but at least in the United States, there are not that many electric vehicles. So let's stop and think about this for a second and talk about, let's just use CO2 as a proxy for one of our bigger environmental concerns. So how do you measure, how is CO2 actually produced in the transportation system? And this is work by, again, one of the late great transportation researchers, Lee Schipper. And this is called the Schipper identity, that CO2 is basically the product of four terms. The first is, how much do we travel in a given mode, right? Now, travel is one of those things that is linked to wealth. As we get wealthier, we like to travel more. We like to go on vacations. We like to go farther away. But the directionality actually goes the other way too, which is that in some cases we're traveling more so that we can become wealthier, because in many cases you have to drive a little farther to get access to a job that's paying you better. Now this is work from Schaefer and Victor going back more than 20 years ago. What they found is as people get wealthier, not only do they like to travel more, but they also like to travel faster. So if you used to be walking, now you're biking as you get wealthier. You go from biking to potentially bus, or bus to a motorcycle, motorcycle to a car. So this is a trend that we've seen over many, many decades. The second term in this equation, which is the ratio of vehicle kilometers to passenger kilometers, that's basically another way of saying how efficiently can we pack people into those vehicles, right? Now, I think notionally, it's very tempting to think about this as the way we've always thought about carpooling, right? So maybe Stefano and I, maybe we're at work together one day and we're talking in the cafeteria, and maybe we discover we're neighbors. We didn't know it, right? We're neighbors. And so what do we decide to do? We say, aha, we can do this, right? So Stefano is person A, I'm person B, and our individual travel used to be the solid lines. Now we're going to get into a car together and carpool, and now our vehicle travels the dashed line, right? So what we've done effectively is we've cut our vehicle distance in half just because of a conversation in the cafeteria, right? And it's tempting to think that new shared mobility modes will inherently deliver that sort of cut it in half magnitude in terms of the ratio of vehicle distance to passenger distance. But the real world is more complicated, right? It's a lot more complicated. And the reason is because in reality, Stefano we probably aren't going exactly the same direction. We're going generally the same direction. And a vehicle that's going to pick us up is actually going to travel out of its way in order to go pick up Stefano and pick up me and then drop us each off at our different destinations. Now, if we compare the dashed line here to the sum of the two solid lines in distance, is it half the distance? Definitely not, right? It might, in fact, in some cases, even be a little bit longer. And so when we think about packing more people into the vehicles, it's a real technical challenge to actually do it and still achieve anything like the reductions that we kind of have a mental model in the informal space to think about these things. Yeah? Scoop. Exactly, and so what Stefano is pointing out is that you do in fact have to go out of the way, and maybe one more detail on that is that the occupancy of the vehicle and this ratio of vehicle kilometers to passenger kilometers are not necessarily the same thing. I think it's that ratio that's important to pay attention to. Now, in addition to the technical challenge in getting more people into vehicles together, there's also, of course, the social challenge, right? Which is that in some cases, these are vehicles that you don't really want to share space with other people in. And so I think as we move towards an automated vehicle future, and we're actually reducing the cost of each of those kilometers, potentially what we're doing is also reducing the premium you have to pay for a dedicated ride. So there may be a dampening effect as we reduce the cost of transportation that pushes people in some cases back towards an individual travel mode to avoid scenarios like this. So what's the third term in this CO2 shipper identity here? It's basically how efficient are the vehicles? And this is the traditional way that we've regulated vehicles. And then finally, how clean is that particular energy source, the amount of CO2 that we're generating per unit energy. So let's talk a little bit about vehicles in the ride-hailing space. So this is just some statistics on a fleet survey that a friend of mine ran a few years ago. You see a lot of hybrid vehicles, and chances are if you've taken an Uber or a Lyft in the past few weeks, you've probably ridden in the back of a hybrid, either a Prius or a Camry or one of the other brands that are used. Now, there's been a recent initiative in California to push for electrification. That's California State Bill 1014, pushing for ride-hailing electrification. And the specifics on the bill are finalized, but the way it's going to be implemented is still not finalized. But I wanted to ask you this question. If EVs are the objective, how would you achieve it? How would you actually achieve this level of electrification in ride-hailing if that's really what you want to do? So I'd like to ask you to engage in a little mental exercise with me, okay? So everybody ready? So close your eyes and pretend you're an Uber driver or a Lyft driver or a Didi driver. Okay, so you ready? You're gonna close your eyes, getting in the car, turn on the ignition, it's not a push button ignition, and then you open up the app and you're ready to deliver rides, right? Everybody with me? Okay. Tell me what your travel day looks like. How far are you going to drive? You going to be close to home or are you going to be far away from home? Going to be near a charging station or far away from a charging station? Anybody got an answer? You got no idea, right? You have absolutely no idea what your travel day is going to look like. And so as academics, a few years ago, what you used to see was a lot of studies looking at the distribution of trip distance, or the distribution of travel day, and then a comparison to the available range of electric vehicles, and saying, well, it's a perfectly rational decision for a customer to go buy one of these electric vehicles because the vehicle has more than enough range to meet their 90th percentile travel day. But the problem is you inherently make the assumption that you know what your travel day is going to look like. And in the ride-hailing space, that is not a good assumption to make. And so I had a few recommendations for implementation of greater electrification in the ride-hailing space. First of all, we need to build confidence among ride-hailing drivers. We really need to bridge that gap between the vehicle state of charge in this case specifically, and the distribution or the allocation or the dispatch of these trips. You really need to allocate trips that accommodate the remaining range of the vehicles. Now, by the way, that's not a trivial thing to do because Uber or Lyft or your ride-hailing company of choice have to know the state of charge of the vehicle. So they basically need to have access in something like real time to the vehicle state. Now, the second thing, mobility on demand, but known in advance. We're starting to see more progression in this space, allowing you to book trips farther in advance and provide some financial incentives to do so. Finally, the third recommendation is that we really need green ride preferences to build EV demand. So anybody taken a flight on United recently? Few people? I'm sorry, I have too. But one of the things that you'll notice in United and some of the other airlines is the ability to purchase carbon offsets for your trip, right? You can basically say, I like to make this a carbon neutral trip, and you tack on a few dollars, and nominally somebody's going to plant enough trees to offset the carbon in your trip, right? How many people do you think pay for these? Not very many is the short answer. And have any of you paid for carbon offsets? All right, I rest my case, right? And there have been a number of studies that have said the willingness to pay for carbon offsets is vanishingly close to zero for a big chunk of the population, right? But what if, instead of having to pay extra money, you just said, I'll wait a few extra minutes. I'll wait 5 more minutes for an EV rather than actually having to pay a little bit more money. That's one of the things that I actually think we need to introduce going forward. Okay, let's, in the interest of time, I think I'll skip forward to this topic, micromobility. How many of you have taken a ride in an e-scooter or an e-bike recently? Quite a few, great. They're a lot of fun, right? I hope you wear a helmet, but they're a lot of fun. But the relationship between cities and ride-hailing providers or micromobility providers has really been pretty tough, because this was not the first time that a transportation service came to cities without asking for permission, right? So overnight in a lot of cities, these scooters just appeared, and people started doing some pretty irresponsible things with them. This one was from last year. Somebody rode a scooter across the Bay Bridge in the vehicle lane, right? That's a pretty long ride on a pretty small scooter on a windy bridge, right? And so what happened? The cities were really angry, and we got policies like this. I call it the Johnny Test micromobility policy, which is they basically outright bans in many cases, or very strict caps on the number of vehicles. So I don't think either of these things are productive. And so I wrote about this last year with a couple of colleagues of mine at Stanford. And really what we tried to identify was the fact that in micromobility, there's not really a good way to implement a pilot. Why is that? Because we think about a pilot, we think about a small number of vehicles with a sort of a limited impact in a city, right? But now you put yourself in the shoes of the customer and you say, I want to try one of these new services. And you open up the app and you say, nearest vehicle is 2 miles away. We say, I'll close the app and I'll do something else. Let's say the next day you do the same thing. Nearest vehicle is 2 miles away. How many times do you do that before you basically say, I'm just done, this isn't working for me? Right? Only a few times. And so one of the problems that these micromobility companies actually have to deal with is that for a set of customers to make a lifestyle choice about how they get around, there needs to be near bulletproof availability, 95, 99% availability for these services, which means that you need to over deploy the vehicles, and you need to scale very rapidly the number of vehicles available to these customers. But on the other hand, what's the job of a regulator? The job of a regulator, I'm very empathetic to, by the way, is to protect the population. And if you have a new transportation device and a new transportation service, and you don't really understand the risk of that service, allowing it to grow unbounded in scale means you're effectively allowing unbounded risk to your population, which would be an abdication of your responsibility as a regulator, right? So we wrote an article about this a couple of months ago, and basically the conclusion that we came to is that you need to let these things grow unbounded in scale, but with clear demarcations and evaluations in time, to let the pilots happen bounded in time rather than in size. So I think let me just make a couple more comments, and then let's go to the Q&A. The first thing that I wanted to say is that there's been some debate over this idea of telecommuting as being the solution to all of our problems, right? Will we still need to travel? And if we think about that four-term equation, the shipper identity a few slides ago, this would be a really big lever if you could just reduce the amount of travel that people are making, right? So one way to really decide how you come out on this debate is to say, well, do you believe that transportation and communication are complements, or are they substitutes? And you can come up with rational arguments to stay on either side of that debate, right? So let's make the argument for the transportation and communication being substitutes. So let's say Samsung decides to implement a telework policy. Maybe you have one already, I don't know. Maybe say up to 2 days a week, people can choose to work from home and telecommute rather than showing up at the office, right? You're putting in a big dent into that number of vehicle miles traveled, and you're doing it because those things could be substitutes. So let's take an example on the other side of that debate. How many of you use some sort of social networking? Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, pretty much everybody, right? Now, how many of you are in touch with somebody from a past lifetime that without the existence of that social network, you would have lost touch with? Pretty much everybody, right? So what this is meaning is that our social network is larger than it ever has been before. And one of the things about having a large social network is this is more people that you want to stay in touch with. And you want to actually go have a beer with these people. You want to have a conversation with them in person, not just over the social networking platform. So what that actually might mean is that that transportation and communication are complements, not substitutes, and that more communication might in fact lead to more transportation, not less. Now, there's a great book called The Triumph of the City that's written by a Harvard professor, Ed Glazer, And he comes down mostly on the side of these two things being in fact more complements than they are substitutes. So my point on this is that, yeah, we're probably still going to need to travel, and communication is not going to solve all of these problems for us. So one more word before Q&A, which is this. Big changes are generational, and they require education. I'd really just like to make 2 points with a small anecdote. This is my son, Oliver. This was several years ago. He's actually 7 now, so he's quite a bit larger. But when he was 2.5, I used to let him plug my car into the charging station when I would stop next to work. So we would ride together. He would plug the car in, and then we would walk off, and I would drop him off at preschool. And he would do this almost every day, and if my daughter was there, then she would do it as well. And I didn't really think much about it. This was just kind of our little routine that we got into. And then fast forward to a couple years later when he was 4. For his 4th birthday party, we bought him a Hot Wheels toy car set, right? And what was the first thing that he did when he opened that Hot Wheels toy car set? He took a gas pump, which was part of this little set, and he plugged it into the back of the car, and he said, "My car is charging. My car is charging." And this is really kind of a light bulb moment for me, because what I realized was that this had become the new normal for him. Just something that was part of our daily routine, that was the new normal for him. So I'd encourage you 2 things. Number 1 is walk the talk, right? So if this is something that you truly believe, it's something that you need to live. Number 2 is some of these changes are generational, and inherently adoption of some of these new technologies is going to take quite a bit of time. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and happy to take a few questions.